Hello and welcome back to the competitive biography of Emanuel Lasker. We are somehow still not done with the match between Lasker and Bird because for the past two games, not only has Lasker failed to win, but actually Bird even won the last one. So if Bird manages to get 6 more wins before Lasker gets his final 7th win, then Bird will actually win the match. Will he get there? Let's find out. Bird once again switches up his first move and does not go for f4, but this time goes the complete different direction with c4, the English opening. Now, as is common with most Bird games, we're not going to be getting a very theoretical discussion, and after e6, e3, and knight to f6, here Bird plays f4. Now, perhaps unsurprisingly, this move in this particular position has never been played before or since, though we'll transpose back to known games in a moment, so it's not quite a novelty. After Lasker's moves of d5 and after knight to f3, c5, Bird keeps a fairly consistent game plan. He takes on d5, c captures d5, e captures d5, and gives this consistent check on b5. Lasker blocks with his bishop, and after bishop captures on d7, knight captures on d7, Bird prepares to develop his other bishop with b3. Now, I found another semi-recent game from this particular position, where Black went with very regular development. Bishop to d6, bishop to b2, castles, castles, and rook to e8. This was played in the game between Vladimir Golovankov and Yuri Nikolaev from 2008, with White ultimately winning this game. Lasker instead opted to remain consistent as well, and once again played the kingside fianchetto with g6. This move is a novelty, and so it's as of move 8 that the players are playing a unique game. Following the expected moves bishop to b2, bishop to g6, and both players castling, the commentators of the day felt very optimistic for Bird, saying that this is the kind of position he likes. It's hard for me to personally say just how happy Bird is with his opening. It is quite open, which certainly suits his style, but given that he traded off one of his bishops, and he only has this one that's occupied on the same diagonal as Lasker's counterpart, it's hard to see just exactly how he's going to take advantage. We'll have to wait and find out. Bird played knight to a3, and Lasker ensured that it could not advance to b5 by putting his pawn on a6, and instead Bird sent it back to c2. Now, here Lasker played what was considered a very committal move in knight to e4, offering the trade of bishops. Amos Byrne commented that he thinks the bishop trade is better for White, which is very possible because these pawns could become somewhat vulnerable in the endgame. One potential problem that Black is facing is that if they play some neutral developing move like rook to e8, then White has this annoying move b4. The point being that after c4, you can simply solidify the structure with a3. And this knight is now kind of stuck. If Black ever moves it, like let's say knight to e4 in this or in some sort of equivalent position, then now White will trade on g7, and the d4 square is available. So a knight will take up d4. This is a very powerful square, and White has certainly gained quite the asset. One very concrete merit to Lasker's plan of knight to e4 is that after the bishop trade on g7, b4 is still possible here, and after c4, yes, the knight can immediately occupy the d4 square, but Black can save the tempo played on the neutral move like rook to e8, which would lead us back into a similar position, and instead immediately go after this b-pawn with a5, and on a3 play the move queen to e7. If White wants to defend the pawn, they either have to play ugly moves like retreating the knight back to c2, or potentially giving up the a file with rook to b1. Either way, it's a little bit of an awkward position, and Black would certainly be for choice. Now, Bird chooses a different direction. Seeing that he already has one knight that's available to take advantage of the d4 square should it ever open up, he instead moves his other knight back to e1. The point being that after Lasker continues expanding with b5, now the c5 pawn is going to be weak for pretty much forever. So he starts attacking it. Queen to c2, only now does Lasker play that rook to e8 move, and this knight settles on d3. The pawn is attacked twice, so Lasker defends it, queen to b6. Bird gives a check on b2, which is blocked with pawn to f6, and now this knight even goes all the way to f2. Now it's worth pointing out that we are 18 moves into the game, and Bird has moved this knight 5 times in a row, from a3 to c2 to e1 to d3, and now to f2. This is what master level chess play looks like, I suppose. For this move, both players touch their a-rooks, with Lasker putting his on b8 and Bird choosing to put his on e1, and now Lasker tries to deal with this weak c5 pawn by pushing it to c4. Now, I don't like this move. It does almost free up the c5 square for the Black knights, but the problem is that White is simply going to push b4 and block it. And again, this move opens up the d4 square. There is a way you can prepare this by playing the move b4. This enables c4 to be pushed. If White tries to kick the knight away with d3, then for one, the c3 square has been opened, and this is a nice outpost for the Black knight. Much more likely is that he'll trade this knight, so knight captures e4, d captures e4, and now the best square for this knight is g5, taking advantage of this pinned f6 pawn. but now black is allowed to play c4. And after b captures on c4, they do get this knight to c5. Knight to d3 is threatened. This knight lacks a good square if the king ever moves out of the pin, and overall black has very good compensation for the pawn. But Lasker chose to play c4 right away, and as mentioned, Bird gets a very nice response in b4, so now Lasker lacks a very proactive follow-up move, and he decides to play his 20th move as simply rook to b7, making the time control with what I would say is a rather flexible move. It makes later development easier if he ever wants to double the rooks on a file, but Bird immediately gets what he wants, as after knight captures e4, d captures on e4, finally he's allowed to take the d4 square with his knight. So this is a very strong minor piece for Bird. He's finally starting to get some resources into the game, and now if he's able to deal with the fact that some of his major pieces are perhaps not as active as he'd like, he suddenly has the makings of a very powerful position. So Lasker begins his defensive campaign by retreating his king back to the safer g8 square, and Bird continues, as he always does, forward with pawn to g4. Now Lasker defends this with knight to f8, pointing out that f5 would be a little bit premature, as the e5 square opens up, and black can actually move this knight right back to d7. White doesn't really gain anything right away from opening the f-file because the f6 pawn is protected twice. Black will be able to play knight to e5 next, and they'll be solid enough. So Bird instead prepares it and slow rolls the position a little bit. He plays rook to f2, so that after Lasker's rook to f7, he can play rook e to f1, now doubling on the f-file. Lasker tries to create a little bit of a safe haven elsewhere with his king, so after h6, king to h1, he puts his king on h7, and Bird returns his knight down to e2, opening up this diagonal for the queen. Now, Lasker's position is a little bit awkward to defend. Here he chooses to compromise his king side a little bit more with pawn to f5, which does certainly create a little bit of space, but he is able to gain time on Bird's pieces. What that means is that after Bird opens up the g file with g captures f5, g captures f5, and rook to g2, trying to transfer the file to a more open one, here Lasker is able to play the move queen to f6. And the problem is that there isn't really a good square for this queen to go if you want to avoid the trade that remains somewhat active. The second rank is somewhat cluttered, so if you retreat, it'll take quite a few moves for the queen to get back into the attack. So it's actually more efficient for Bird here, if he wants to go on the attack, to trade queens, which he does. Queen captures f6 and rook captures f6. Bird finishes doubling on the g file with rook f to g1, but now Lasker shows that his defense is fine if he simply puts his rook back on f7. He's covered both of the important infiltration squares that the rook could land on, so there isn't really anything good for Bird to do. He is able to put his rook all the way back on g8, but this doesn't really come with a target that's too difficult for Lasker to deal with. He moved his rook to d8, so that after this knight returned to d4, he has the move knight to e6, and now Bird is basically forced to trade rooks. Rook captures d8, and knight captures d8. So the material is equal, both players have 3 pawn islands, a knight and a rook each, and neither king is especially active, so I would classify this as an equal endgame, but there's no reason not to play it out for a while. This is completely risk-free, at least for Bird. The English master immediately creates a noticeable advantage with a4, b captures a4, and now rook to a1. There's no way to defend the pawn, so Lasker tries to solidify the a6 pawn behind it with rook to f6, and after rook captures on a4, the king actively places itself on g6, keeping an eye on the weak f5 pawn. Bird moves his king up to g2, and now Lasker, in a sense, offers a draw with knight to c6. The point here is that rook captures on a6 leads to a draw. After knight captures d4, rook captures f6, king captures f6, e captures d4. Here black has precisely one move to draw the game, and that is, I'll give you a second, pawn to e3. The point is that after the king gets close, king to f3, e captures d2, king to e2, and c3. The white king has to babysit both of these 2 pawns, while the black king can go back and babysit these 2 pawns. Otherwise, things are completely equal. The kings will end up shuffling around, and it will be a draw. So if Bird wanted a draw, he could claim one after rook captures on a6, but he decides on move 39 no less, so on very low time, to continue playing for the win, and he retreated this knight once again back to e2. Now it's Lasker's turn to make the moves to hit the time control, so he decides on knight to a7, and for their 40th moves, the players play king to f2 and knight to b5. So again, this is a more or less equal endgame. You could say that Bird has the sort of moral advantage of having the better pawn structure and better squares for his knight. These dark squares in the center are very vulnerable and good outposts for him. But if Lasker doesn't make a mistake, this should still end up in a draw. So how to push for a win as Bird? Well, he starts with the move rook to a5. Lasker played rook to d6, attacking the d2 pawn, and Bird defends this with rook back to a2. We have rook to b6 from Lasker, and now rook back to a5, and the players repeat. Rook to d6, rook to a2, rook to b6, and of course Bird is not going to now play for the draw by repeating with rook to a5. He instead retreats down to a1. He's going to once again try to take advantage of the open g file and get some action going on the king side. Lasker chooses to defend against this kingside incursion by starting with the move knight to c7. After rook g1 check and king to f6, h4. Now here, rook captures on b4 is possible, but black has to be a little bit careful. After h5, they can't get very ambitious, because on rook to b2, trying to go after the d2 pawn once again, of course white is going to play rook g6 check. The king moves somewhere, and now rook captures on h6. You don't have time to take the d pawn, as rook to h7 check is threatened, so this knight has to go down to d5, and now white simply defends the pawn with king to e1. This h-pawn is going to be a serious threat, especially in any endgame with knights, and so probably safest for black is going to be just repeating rook b1, rook b2, and again, I do believe it should end up in a draw. Instead of this, Lasker decides that the b4 pawn can be taken pretty much whenever he wants, and he instead starts with knight to d5. The point being that after h5, he covers the g6 square by retreating his knight back to e7. So okay, that ally is taken away from Bird, he returns his rook over to a1, and now this knight returns to d5. Now again, there's a chance for a repetition. If you go back to g1, the knight goes back to e7, but Bird continues shuffling around with the position and returns his knight to d4 once again. Now, suddenly this endgame has actually become very difficult for Lasker, and there is only one move here that actually keeps him in the game. c3 is the way to go. The point being is that white wants to trade here, d captures c3, knight captures on c3, and now one of their prime threats, rook to a5, is very easily parried by knight to b5. As well, if you go back to the king side with rook to g1, knight to d5 is a good move because on rook g6 and the king moving back, the knight is defending the rook. So after rook captures b6, knight captures b6, knight captures on f5, you can return the knight to d5. Yes, the h6 pawn is going to fall with check, but the b pawn is going to follow, and this should ultimately end up with a drawn king and pawn endgame. However, here Lasker decided to take the b4 pawn with his knight. And this is not as good a move because rook to a5 does not have a very satisfactory answer. Here Lasker cements his knight on the very active d3 square, with check no less, but after king to g3, he has nothing better than to simply retreat his king. Knight captures on f5 comes with check anyways, and after king to d7, Bird calmly returns his knight once again to the d4 square. Now this pawn trade of b4 for f5 greatly favors Bird, who now has the very simple plan of moving his king up to g4 to f5 and finally taking the e4 pawn. These pawns would become passed, and the endgame would suddenly become very difficult for Lasker. Now, one way that Lasker could stop this threat is to play knight to c1. The point being that if the king goes up to g4, then knight to b3 comes, and the piece coordination for white is disrupted. But after rook to d5 with check, the king moves somewhere, let's say king to e8, here comes knight to f5. And now the problem is that white is going to play knight to d6. In this position, it comes with check, but regardless, the c pawn is coming under fire. So black probably loses a pawn. They can save it for a little bit with c3, where after d captures on c3, there's this check on e2. The king moves somewhere, and now knight captures on c3. But the problem here is rook to c5. You kick the knight away from somewhere, it stops guarding the e4 pawn, and in this particular position, white can play rook to e5 check, taking on e4 next, again having connected passed pawns in the center and probably winning this endgame. Lasker saw that he was more than likely going to lose a pawn, so he gave it up on his own terms by throwing his rook down to b2. So that after rook captures a6, rook captures d2, rook captures on h6, yes, Lasker is down a pawn, but he does get quite a bit of activity because of knight to e1. Now checks starting with rook to g2 are possible. But Bird is able to give the checks first. He plays rook to h7 check, king to d6, and now the passed pawns start rolling. h6, c3, and rook to h8. Now, unfortunately for Lasker, he loses this race in all variations, chiefly because this knight on d4 is very strong. For example, if he plays c2 here, then this knight is free to simply take it. Knight captures c2, rook captures c2, and h7, and black is too slow to stop her motion. After rook g2 check, it's important that this king sits on h3, and you can't give another check. Black has to spend a move playing rook to g1, and now white promotes. Rook d8 check, king to e6, h8 creates a queen, and yes, you are able to take the queen off the board with the skewer, rook h1, king g3, rook h8, but black is down the exchange and a pawn and is completely lost here. So Lasker instead tried king back to d7, but this doesn't have much of a different result. After h7 and c2, Bird gave the thematic check on d8, rook d8 check, king captures d8, h8 creates a queen with check, king down to d7, and now the checks begin. Queen g7 check, king to d6, and queen to e5 check from Bird. Knight to f5 is perhaps the most precise check. If the king goes down to d5, then the queen can go to d7 with check. And if the king goes to c5, then you have this check here on c3. Either way, white wins the rook and ends all further discussion. Queen to e5 check doesn't necessarily spoil anything, but it does take a little bit more work to get a definitively winning tactic. The king goes back to d7, and now queen to b5 with check, king to c8 and queen to c5 with check, king to d7 and queen to d5 check, king to c8 and queen to a8 check, king to d7. You can see Lasker's plan is to simply repeat and hope that Bird doesn't run into any useful tactics, but here he played queen to b7 check. And it was here on move 69 that Lasker finally resigned the game. The point being that no matter what he does, he runs into some danger. If you go back to d8, this is the simplest. It's a very straightforward mate in 2, knight c6, queen to e7, game over. If you go king to d6, then we have another fork, queen to b4 check, again wins the rook and the game is over. And finally, if black plays king to e8, then you don't necessarily win anything quite as cleanly, but I think that white is fine to simply take on e4 with check, the king moves somewhere, and you can finally take the c2 pawn. This material imbalance, even without the pawns, would probably be slightly better for white, but with the 2 extra pawns, white is just completely winning. So there you go. Bird wins his second game of the match, and in a way that I absolutely could not have anticipated, given that I've gone through quite a few Bird games. I never thought that he would win an equal endgame grind. He was rewarded here on move number 50. That is a very late time for Bird to be rewarded. Lasker taking this pawn and finding no way to defend the resulting endgame. That's actually quite an impressive result for Bird, and I'm being completely serious this time. With this game, the match is still not over. Lasker has, for the 3rd time in a row, failed to secure the 7th and final win, so we have even more games to cover. The match continues in the next video. I look forward to seeing you there. Until then.